What I will be talking in this talk, content of it, first I will say a few words about me and my experiences, then something about safety limits, about scientific evidence for health risk, then is about precautionary principle, then finally on conflict of interests, and also about WHO EMF project and ICNIRP, and few final conclusions. So who I am? Well, I have 2 doctorates and docentship in biochemistry. I worked for 22 years at STUK, this Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority. Part of time I was head of radiation biology lab. Longer time I was research professor at this institution. Meanwhile, working at STUK, I was also visiting professor at Harvard, at Zhejiang University in China, and at Swinburne University in Australia. I testified in US Senate hearing in 2009, so these are some of my expert jobs, and I participated in IARC 2011 meeting where we classified carcinogenicity of cell phone radiation as possible human carcinogen. And also I advised different authorities like Parliament of Finland, US National Academies, WHO, IARC, BFS, ICNIRP, Swiss National Foundation here in Switzerland. Well, this is how it all started, that somebody got good idea to use technology that was developed for US Army for civilian purposes, that it will help us to communicate with each other. And this way, cell communication, cell phones began to be made for us regular people, but they were not tested ever for their health impact on people before they were introduced to shops and that we could buy them. Exception was made by Food and Drug Administration in US, and which allowed cell phones to be sold without pre-market testing. And this rationale was low power exclusion, meaning that those devices emit so low power energy that we should not be worried. So it means in practice that those gadgets were introduced. This is first time in history of humankind when we put so close radiation emitting device to our head. And because it has low power, it got this exclusion that it can be sold, but at the same time we are making research whether it has any impact on our health or not. So we are sort of like experimental rabbits. Safety limits and safety standards. Safety limits are being advised by ICNIRP, and safety standards are based on those safety limits advised by ICNIRP, but safety standards are set by different countries differently, in different way. There are several problems associated with safety standards. First of all, we don't have information whether and how cell phone radiation affects humans. All this information that we have is, you could say, second-hand. We have a population of people that are using cell phones, and then we are trying to see whether some disease or ailment is beginning to increase within population. But this is not really direct proof that just the cell phone radiation is causing it. This is just coincidence, or can be coincidence or not. We don't have this information because we never did studies where we expose people, take their tissues, analyze them biochemically, and say, when we expose person to cell phone radiation, this and this gene or protein is changing its properties, activity, what it's doing. This kind of studies have been done so far 3. So meaning that we don't have this information. There, of course, we don't have certainty that safety standards protect all users from anything besides thermal effects. If there is too high level of radiation, of course, it is heating, and we know that heating is not very good. It can cause some biological problems. So the safety standard and safety limits are set up to not exceed this thermal effect. So the thermal effect is not cost to us, most likely. But we don't know what else is there involved, because we don't know how cell phones affect our body physiologically. We don't know it. Any equipment that is radiating below safety standards is considered automatically to be safe. And this means that anybody can install it anywhere at your will, because it is safe, no problem. And this might be, of course, misleading. And this compliance with the safety standards is currently used as an excuse to stop research, because our devices are safe because they meet safety standards. So why to bother to do more research when we already implemented safety standards that cause that there is no problem? So when you go nowadays to funding agencies and you propose project to study this topic, they have to weigh, do we give money to this project where ICNIR, WHO say everything is fine, is safe, or do we give money to, for example, Ebola project? Well, you know who is winning. But at the same time, it's not necessarily so, because we have to always put things in perspective, that there are nowadays 7 billion cell phone users around the world. Finland has 5 million people. There are 6 million of cell phones in use. And something sensor is saying something in German, I don't know. And finally, these non-thermal effects, they exist because there are studies showing that they exist, but they are refused to be acknowledged, because if thermal effects non-thermal effects, would be acknowledged that they are really existing, then safety standards would need to be revised. And there is one problem. What we are all the time dealing with is this macro-scale dosimetry, so meaning dosimetry, how radiation is distributed in our head. And this, what is done is to test compliance and to test how those devices are working. Scientists are using mold in shape of half-human head, which is filled with water, little sugar and little salt to mimic ionic strength of human brain. And there are put different probes and radiation is being measured. Everything is fine. However, there is a very big problem, namely is free movement of ions. In this bucket with water, ions move freely, whereas in our brain they don't, because there are mechanisms preventing movement of ions from one compartment in cell to another compartment in cell. If ions could move freely in our brain, we would be all dead instantly. Now, something about scientific evidence for health risk. Is there such evidence, and what should we do with it? But first we have to think about firewalls. Namely, research is being done and research has to be funded. Some research is funded by different foundations, some research is funded by governments, by taxpayers' money, some research is funded by industry. And then they figured out this kind of thing like firewalls, namely, industry doesn't give money directly to scientists, but they give to some organization that handles this money, and this organization gives money to scientists. So meaning scientists are not in direct contact with the industry. But unfortunately, it is sort of bogus situation, because first of all, the industry knows whom they are funding, because they give money to certain organization and this provides grant for certain scientists. So meaning industry knows who is getting this money. Scientists know who is funding them. They know that it is not this organization where from they get money, but it is this industrial partner. And firewall keeper is profiting from providing this so-called firewall because it's administering industry's money for scientists. So it is being paid. So it is also in firewall institution interest to keep this kind of situation. And this situation resembles the proverbial public secret. Everyone knows about it, but nobody wants to talk about it. Then in 2011 was first evaluation of scientific evidence concerning cell phone radiation effects. And it was done by International Agency for Research on Cancer, and that's why only evidence concerning cancer was analyzed. There was no any talk about EHS or any other diseases that people suspect that could be linked with cell phone radiation. So that was only, absolutely only about cancer. And they invited 30 experts divided in 4 different groups studying dosimetry, epidemiology, animal studies, and laboratory studies. Decisions were made by consensus or by simple majority if scientists could not get consensus. And at the end, when came to the voting, the vast majority of 30 experts voted for the classification of cell phone radiation as a possible carcinogen, group 2B. That was, for many, shock, because nobody expected before this meeting that cell phone radiation will be classified as any kind of carcinogen. When we looked in 2011, I was part of this group at IARC, when we looked at the evidence, considering epidemiology, there were in practice 2 sets of data, one provided by Interphone project in Europe and another set of data from Hardell group in Sweden. Problem with those studies is that they don't have reliable exposure data because data is based on person's memory. This is one only problem, because when they are asking, or they were asking person how many minutes per day you used cell phone last year, 2 years ago, 10 years ago, it is of course possible to remember better or worse. But this is not the only problem with exposure, because one could say that all epidemiological studies that have been done to date, their exposure estimates are garbage. They are rubbish. Because even if we know precisely how many minutes person was talking on a cell phone, it doesn't give information, reliable information about exposure. Because when you have a cell phone, when you take it out and you look on this bar graph there in cell phone, how good field you have. Sometimes you have all those bars full, you are in very good field. Sometimes you go a little further, some other place, and you have hardly any bars valid there. So it means that you are far from base station, or there are some obstacles between you and base station that your reception is very bad. And what is happening then? Then is happening this, that when you have a good reception, your cell phone emits very little radiation to communicate with cell tower. When you are in bad field, this cell phone emits much more radiation to communicate with the cell tower. So it means that when you have in epidemiological study 2 persons, one who is having 1 minute of time and another who has also 1 minute of time, depending where they were located for most of the time, their exposures can be dramatically different. But in spite of all these problems, both of those studies, Interphone and Hardel, found a risk increase in long-term avid users to develop brain cancer glioma. There was also a children's study called Cephalo, but exposures were only for 2 to 4 years, what is nothing, is exceptionally short time, and had no statistical power to detect small risk. If there would be very high risk, it would detect it. But with very small risk, it couldn't detect it. That there were too few cases to analyze. And when combining this with 2 to 4 years of exposure time, it is really, really nonsense. But still, many people since 2011 are complaining that this evidence, epidemiological evidence, was wrongly evaluated, that was evaluated irresponsibly, that Leonard Hardel should not have been there because he was co-author of a set of important studies. Well, this is the group of epidemiologists that classified cell phone radiation as a possible carcinogen. They classified, they came to the conclusion that there is limited evidence that cell phone radiation is causing brain cancer glioma. Leonard Hardel was only one person in this fairly large group. There were quite many others, including Martin Rössli from Switzerland. Therefore, that was a group of very respected, highly respected epidemiologists who, having only Interphone and Hardel data, decided, yes, there is enough evidence to say something about increased risk. After IARC, there were published several different papers in epidemiology, and they are causing some problems. There is a set of trend data from Little and collaborators in US published in 2012, and this paper is showing slow rise of brain cancer cases in US. But this trend is similar to this what eventually Interphone would predict, but it is lowered from this what Hardel's data would predict. Then there are 2 cohort studies that are quarreled about, and I have written about both of those studies, especially about Danish cohort study in the Scientist magazine. I criticized it very much. Namely, both cohort studies, they don't have even this poor exposure data as Interphone and Hardel studies. Namely, Danish cohort bases exposure on how long you owned cell phone connection with provider. So it means that person who is talking very little, making 1 phone call maybe a day, and person who is talking for hours per day, but they both have this connection with provider for last 10 years. They are analyzed in the same group. They are the same way exposed according to Danish cohort. This is one of the only problems with Danish cohort, that it is really, really rubbish. Then there is a Million Women study in UK and published in 2014. It shows no effect, but exposure data is very inadequate. Namely, that was study that was designed to examine effects of hormonal therapies on menopausal women. So it was very special subpopulation. But then somebody got genius idea. Let's ask them how they use cell phones, so we can use this cohort also for cell phone. So, did you use never cell phone, less than once a day, or every day? That's their exposure data for this study. That's a joke. And last year was published in France a study called Serenade, and it is similar study to Interphone and Hardel. This is also this case control study. And it has also similar unreliable exposure data like Hardel and Interphone, namely people are asked how much they use their cell phone. But Serenat study arrives at the same conclusions what Interphone and Hardel arrived. Namely that if you use cell phone for half an hour per day for 10 years or longer, your risk of getting brain cancer increases. In case of Interphone, it was increased by 40%. In case of Hardel studies, it was 170%. So there is this argument, one is saying only 40, one is saying 170, so there is huge discrepancy between those studies. Serenat is showing something in between, 100% increase. But one has to remember that they were done in very different conditions, in very different human populations. They are not exactly comparable precisely this way to say that this percentage means very, very much. And in my opinion, epidemiological evidence supports cancer risk because IR classification was based on the results of Interphone and Hardel studies. Then came Serenat study, as I mentioned last year. And this French study reached similar conclusions of Interphone and Hardel, meaning that long-term avid use of cell phone increases risk of developing brain cancer. So now we have 3 replications of the same epidemiological type of study, those case control studies, that all suggest that cell phone radiation might increase risk of developing brain cancer. So we have 3 replicates. And this is what I was mentioning, that all epidemiology studies have completely unreliable exposure data. And out of this, to take a home message is this, that ongoing cohort study Cosmos, which is ongoing in UK and also in Finland, in some Nordic countries, collects exposure data as length of calls. This difference is there, that they are not asking people how much you used your cell phone, but they get this information from the operator, how many minutes person was talking on the phone, was using cell phone. So this way they avoid recall bias, but still how many minutes person was talking on cell phone doesn't provide information about the real radiation exposure. End of story. But there is a way to collect real exposure data because there are applications, apps for cell phones, for smartphones, that is possible to install and collect this real information. I have this kind of app on my phone because this company Cellrate, where I'm on advisory board, they are developing, or they develop this kind of software, and one type of this software is already available on internet, possible to download, where I can see continuously how much I'm exposed to Wi-Fi, cell tower, and cell phone radiation. It is collecting continuously. If I open it, I can see it now, during last minute, during last week, and if I go to cloud, I see for how long I've been using this software. So meaning we don't know, or we are not aware, that in our cell phones, our smartphones, there is an enormous number of different sensors that collect information which is going to cell phone providers. And if somebody knows how to tap to this information, can do different things with it. Like, for example, find out how much we are exposed to cell phone radiation and collect this information. Believe or not, this software can tell you whether your exposure, based on those sensors in your cell phone, whether you were exposed to cell phone radiation keeping your phone next to your head, or keeping your phone in your pocket, or maybe on table, or maybe it was upside down. All this information is there. It is continuously collected, all information. So this kind of apps is possible to install on cell phones, and 10 years later, scientists have access to exposure data which shows real exposure, how much we were exposed. Doesn't matter where we were. We don't need to worry that we were in downtown of Zurich or we were somewhere in mountains. It collects information how much we exposed ourselves to this radiation. Besides epidemiology, IARC evaluation looked also at human studies, but there is a big problem because this vast majority of human studies are, as I call them, feeling studies, namely people, either regular healthy people, so-called, or people who are claiming to be electrosensitive, are brought to lab, are exposed to cell phone radiation or cell tower radiation, and then they are asked, how do you feel? Do you feel when radiation is on or radiation is off? And this kind of research is really very, very bad quality research because in case of sensitive people, usually studies are showing something opposite. So meaning when radiation is on, seems like those sensitive people in lab are getting symptoms and vice versa. When radiation is off, they are getting symptoms. But this is a very special situation because you have a person who is claiming to be electrosensitive. This person, when agrees to participate in your experiment, knows I will be exposed to radiation that may or that will cause me harm. But still, for sake of science, I agree and come to lab. This person is stressed. Then otherwise, laboratory conditions are stressful. Then they are bombarded with questions, and they know they should recognize when this radiation is on, when it's off, and they are sort of waiting when those symptoms I begin to feel or not. And this just sort of mental stress can launch variety of symptoms that are also felt by electrosensitive people otherwise. So this kind of reddening of skin, tingling of skin, headache, and so on. This can be caused by a regular stress. You don't need EMF. So if you go to lab and you are very stressed, you may get those symptoms all the time. Is radiation on or off? So for this reason, these feeling studies are not really very informative. This is very subjective, uninformative data. But if we are thinking about EHS, we don't know how to diagnose it and we don't have a proof of it, but it has to exist. It must exist. Why? Because for any environmental factor in human population exists always subgroup of people who are more sensitive to it. Is it pollen? Is it perfume? Is it exhaust? Are different chemicals, medicines, and so on. Always exists group of people who are more sensitive to it than others and get some side effects. Therefore, why electromagnetic fields would be different? The same is for other radiation, UV radiation, gamma radiation. There is also this individual sensitivity of people. Why EMF, electromagnetic radiation, would be different? I don't see any reason. And therefore, even though we don't have evidence, we don't have proof, I think EHS must exist, but we need to find ways to prove it. And of course, one problem with EHS is that it is studied mostly by psychologists, but not physiologists. So psychologists, well, you can call them in American English shrinks. They look at different things than physiologists. So these are wrong methods are used, and because this EHS is not really, I would think, mental problem, mental disease, but it is something what comes from physiological effect and then affects our brain. for example. And of course, WHO definition of health is very important because it is not only our physical health, but it includes also our mental health. So anybody who is worried about electromagnetic radiation and has problem with this and it affects his or her well-being is, according to WHO definition of health, sick person, is not healthy. And that's why it should be dealt with, because it doesn't fulfill this mental and social well-being when we have a problem, even just mentally. And then, of course, this what I already earlier mentioned, that there is lack of studies examining biochemical responses of human tissues to this radiation. There are only 3 of such studies. Then animal studies, they are very much used to find out whether something is causing harm to people, because not all experiments we can do with people, so we use animals. But with cell phone radiation, there is a problem. We cannot make this kind of very commonly made toxicological study where we take animal and expose it to very high overdose of this tested agent and see whether something will happen to this animal. We cannot do it with cell phone radiation because when we overdose it, we hit the animal. In the worst case, you can joke that you can cook it. So this is not possible. So what we have are those lifetime exposures when we take animals when they are still babies or not yet born babies in mother's womb. We expose them to cell phone radiation and expose them throughout their whole life. What is possible? Mouse lives a couple of years. And these exposures are to radiation levels similar to this what people are exposed. But then, if animals react to this radiation, this kind of low-level exposures, then we can think maybe also humans will react. But, as most of those studies show, animals don't react. What it means? It doesn't mean that people are safe, because we are not like those animals. There are diseases and circumstances where animal will react, human will not, and vice versa. So meaning that if animals do not respond to this radiation, we don't know at all whether it is harmful or not harmful for people. We are in our starting point. We don't know anything. But this kind of misleading claims that animal studies do not show effects, so it means that people are safe, are really, really wrong. But there are studies, so-called co-carcinogen studies, meaning when you expose animal to some chemical or radiation that is known to cause cancer, and then simultaneously expose them to cell phone radiation. And then this kind of studies have shown that there is increased development of cancer when animals are co-exposed to carcinogen plus cell phone radiation. So there is some co-effect. And just out of curiosity, or just yesterday, was published study by Alexander Lehr, and this study was replication of study published by Tillman in 2010. This study was fairly small study, not too many animals, has shown that co-carcinogenic effect of cell phone radiation. So cell phone radiation enhanced carcinogenic development of cancer induced by some other carcinogen. What Lehr found with much larger group, he found the same. When you expose animals to low dose of some carcinogenic agent and you expose them simultaneously also to cell phone radiation, you get more cancer in animals. Then there are, of course, those mechanistic studies. And this laboratory evidence was considered in 2011 as insufficient to support or show mechanism for cell phone radiation. So there is some co-effect. And this kind of studies have shown that animals do not react to cell phone radiation. So meaning that if animals do not respond to this radiation, we don't know for cell phone radiation effects, how they could impact on, or how these effects could be induced. So meaning we expose humans to cell phone radiation. Sometimes we think that maybe risk of brain cancer is increasing, but how this radiation would be causing this cancer, we don't exactly know, but I'm not sure that we don't know, but we don't want to maybe accept this, because here is, forget this very complicated image, but look just those few colorful arrows. These are different stress response pathways in human cell. Stress response is this kind of response that when human cell is exposed to some agent that could cause damage to the cell is activating so-called stress response. This is a response to protect itself from this damage, to survive this insult. And those pathways were studied in several studies. Here there are listed few studies. One of them is from my lab. And people who looked at which proteins in those stress pathways are being activated by cell phone radiation found something really similar. Several proteins are being activated in different studies where observed these effects. So it means that those stress pathways can regulate proliferation of cells and expression of cancer regulatory genes. This could be the way how exposing cells to cell phone radiation may participate in development of cancer, for example, or any other effects. And then, in my opinion, the currently available scientific evidence is sufficient to upgrade carcinogenicity of the cell phone radiation from the possible to probable carcinogen. I think that we have enough information when we have this 3 replicates of epidemiological studies, when we have this information about activation of stress response. But activation of stress response is again non-thermal effect that many don't want, stubbornly don't want to acknowledge that it exists. So now, this we know about scientific evidence. What about precautionary principle? Everybody is talking about it. And there are few preconditions to implement precautionary principle. And here is a direct quotation from this year 2000 document of European Union. And it is so that whether or not to invoke precautionary principle is a decision exercised where scientific information is insufficient, inconclusive, or uncertain, where there are indications of potentially dangerous effects, and when those effects are inconsistent with the chosen level of protection of population. So now let's look at those 3 different things: scientific information, danger, and inconsistency with protection levels that we want. So, scientific information is insufficient, inconclusive, or uncertain. Well, IR classification as possible carcinogen means exactly this, that there is information, but it is insufficient, inconclusive, and uncertain to say for sure that cell phone radiation causes brain cancer. But there are those so-called warning signs, red flags, that there are studies like Interphone, Hardel, Serenat. There are indications that the possible effects on human health might be potentially dangerous. Well, what else? Brain cancer is but potentially dangerous disease. So this increased risk of brain cancer in long-term avid users, as shown by Interphone, Hardel, and Serenat, is this potentially dangerous outcome. And then final thing is this inconsistent with the chosen level of protection. And about this is not very much spoken. Ignirp always says that everybody is protected. Grown-ups, children, babies, pregnant, whatever disease you have, you are protected by their safety standards. But let's look this way, that epidemiological studies showing increased risk in long-term avid users, this Hardel, Interphone, Serenade, were generated in populations, groups of people, using regular cell phones that were meeting current safety standards. So those people didn't get cell phone from scientists. They had their cell phone when they went to shop and bought this cell phone. Cell phone which has inbuilt, which has all these safety standards as according to ICNIRP. And it came out that when you use this safe cell phone for 10 years or more, half an hour per day, your risk of getting brain cancer is increasing. So what it means? So apparently those safety standards are insufficient to protect you from risk of brain cancer, long-term avid use of cell phone. So it means that current safety standards are insufficient to protect users. So this third condition to implement precautionary principle is also fulfilled. But there is, of course, there are also people who are saying, well, if you like to implement precautionary principle, well, go back to caves and stop life as we know it now. Well, it is not really so, because precaution doesn't equal prevention. So it doesn't mean that when we are precautionary, that we are preventing you from using your cell phone or any other this type of gadget. There is, of course, strong opposition from telecom industry, and technology providers can be, but if we implement precautionary principle, then technology providers can be made responsible to provide to prove that their product is safe. This is a big problem for telecom industry because it would cost a lot of money to provide this kind of proof. There can be made requirement of making more efficient, less radiation emissions technology. What is possible, I guess, but they don't like it. And limiting current rampant and uncontrolled deployment of wireless networks, it is also not being liked by telecom industry. So this could be outcome of implementing precautionary principle, because then politicians and decision makers could ask for proof of safety, required to make better technologies, and limiting this spread of wireless technologies. But of course, it is not only this that it will be doing bad things, sort of so-called bad things. It will create new knowledge through research, because if we need to study these problems, we need to make biological studies. If we need to develop better technologies, this is a lot of work and enterprise for many people. And of course, it will create new jobs in research and technology, because to resolve these problems, we need to have funding for the from industry, taxpayers and whoever, to develop this information, whether it is safe or not, to develop new technologies. So it might be, it is not this way that life will stop, life will go ahead, but profits might be shifting from place to place. And of course, one thing what we are talking about when thinking precautionary principle, wireless networks, and there is a lot of debate around the world about wireless devices at schools. Should there be Wi-Fi in school? Well, schools are this kind of places that we can implement this kind of precautionary measure, namely, we know where benches are, we can put their wires, and we can get all advantages, and even faster, of internet using wired connection to internet. We don't need Wi-Fi. Then, of course, we are thinking this way that, well, when I go to railway station, I want to get internet. There is no way to have with wired because it will be vandalized. Same thing in airport. So whole airport is Wi-Fi, whole railway station is Wi-Fi, whole hotel is Wi-Fi. Is it needed? Not really. We are thinking that this is impossible. Years back, it was impossible to think that there will be no smoking somewhere. Now there is no smoking almost everywhere. But if you go to airport or to railway station, there are those boxes for smokers. They can smoke there without exposing non-smokers to this carcinogenic agent. The same can be done for wireless. There can be areas within airport which can have walls, shielded walls, where is Wi-Fi provided. Because of course in airport or in railway station you cannot still have wires, so you have to have Wi-Fi, but you can build enclosures where this Wi-Fi is, and the rest of airport is free of Wi-Fi. So there is possible to think, if there is a will, there is a way to resolve this problem. Now about something about conflict of interest. And what is conflict of interest? And here is a quote from Institute of Medicine of the US National Academies, how they define this conflict of interest. It is a set of circumstances that create a risk that professional judgment or actions regarding a primary interest will be unduly influenced by a secondary interest. So it is not this way that you must be doing this, but just appearance of this, that such a possibility exists, is already conflict of interest. And the goal of this conflict of interest policies is to protect integrity of professional judgment and to preserve public trust rather than to remediate bias or mistrust after it occurs. So meaning that those policies should be implemented first before any decisions are made, and then it's necessary to reverse them because maybe somebody has conflict of interest. But then there's a question of sufficiency of conflict of interest disclosure. Because in many different places, people are being asked, please disclose whether you have this or that, and so on. This disclosure of individual and institutional financial relationships is a critical but limited first step in the process. And why? Well, still, if this person with conflict of interest is appointed, this person will be making decisions. How reliable will be decisions made by the person with the conflict of interest, even if this person revealed it? Yes, I have this and this conflict of interest. And how reliable are the past decisions of persons who left the advisory expert committee to work for the industry? There are many this kind of people that work, for example, or some that kind of people that work, for example, for ICNIRP, and then after a few years of working, they left to get better salary from the industry. So now we have to think, were they providing good, honest advice when they were working on committee, or were they providing advice that will be liked by their new employer? And of course, there are some criteria for evaluating conflict of interest policies, and this what is very important, besides proportionality and transparency that everybody knows. There is accountability, meaning if you have conflict of interest and you don't disclose it, or don't disclose it fully, or hide it for whatever reason, you forgot it or you don't want to tell it, that there should be accountability, and not this kind of accountability that they tell you, okay, no, so add this conflict of interest to your resume or something like this, or they wave finger and say, no, do don't this kind of things. No, there should be real measures to enforce it and to have this accountability. Just sometime letting somebody go out of committee doesn't mean that it is really sufficient. Now, there is specifics of bioelectromagnetics, which is a narrow research area. There are not very many scientists, and unavoidably all science is done, evaluated and presented to the general public by a small group of influential players, we could say. And also large research consortia, appointed committees and self-appointed committees consist of the same influential players. So there is some group of more influential players which is relatively small. And also the same applies to the narrow field of influential peer reviewers of new research projects and articles published in peer review journals. So there is sort of like a small pool of scientists, and still smaller is very influential, and everything is turning around them, and they have quite a lot of influence on what research will be done, how research will be done, what will be set out when this research comes out, and how it will be analyzed and presented to decision makers. And of course, as if by default, all of the bioelectromagnetics influential players claim in their disclosures to either have no conflict of interest, or if they have it, they claim to be absolutely unaffected in their scientific decisions by their conflict of interest. So somebody can be doing something for Vodafone on site, or be on board of French Telecom or something like this in advisory role, but they have absolutely no influence of this conflict of interest on whatever they do in some committee. At least they claim so. And of course we can think, all right, should we take this information on face value and trust them? But there can happen cases when something really disturbing happens and makes us to think that maybe we should not trust so much, but rather ask for the evidence and reveal all possible connections. Journalist David Heath in US, he is from the Center for Public Integrity in Washington. He wrote about Patricia Buffler. This woman already passed away. She was a very powerful professor at University of California, and she was dealing with paint and lead paint, how it can affect children. And Buffler's own research indicated that children should be kept away from wet paints because of health problems. Yet, that was in this past 3 years before she passed away, Buffler was paid for more than $360,000 as expert witness on behalf of companies that used to sell lead-based paint. And she was, of course, testifying that everything is fine. So these are those things that, in this case, after a person passed away, something was revealed that there was really serious conflict of interest, which was not revealed. Then accountability in bioelectromagnetics committees, commonly disclosures of conflict of interest, even in very influential committees, are not standardized and seemingly not checked for their accuracy. I read some of those disclosures of conflict of interest in some important committees, and it can happen this way that scientists, two of them, both worked on the same project, which was paid partly by the industry through the so-called firewall. One of those scientists discloses it, says that I was working on project paid by taxpayers and by the industry, those and those companies, through the firewall, this and that. Okay. The other scientist says, I didn't have anything. No conflict of interest at all. They both, and I know it, worked on the same project, side by side. But one of them said so, the other didn't say. And so it means that they are not checked for their accuracy. So meaning they submit conflict of interest and is taken on face value. Okay, fine. You revealed everything? Yes. Okay. Then, of course, with this conflict of interest disclosures, they rely entirely on the willingness of the discloser to make full disclosure. So there seems to be no accountability for any false, erroneous, or incomplete disclosures. So then, if they have incomplete or false disclosure, so then maybe they need to add some information, or maybe they will be excluded from the committee, but who cares? And some examples of those committees, maybe more influential, I don't speak about all of them, like ICNIRP, Senior, and Bioinitiative. If we are thinking about selection of members, ICNIRP and Bioinitiative are sort of like private club. So meaning members of committee are selecting new members of committee, and this selection happens to take into account what opinions those newly elected members have. And this way we have ICNIRP that has everybody agrees and there is consensus that there is no problem. And then we have Bioinitiative, there is also consensus that there is big problem. But it is not this kind of that there would be people with really different opinions and this scientific debate would be going on. And of course, Senior is sort of body system, meaning that on this committee there are only two persons who have any connection with electromagnetic research, because it is a larger committee looking at not only electromagnetic fields. And then for making review, which was, by the way, released yesterday, and if you don't know, everything is in perfect order according to newest, yesterday released report of Senior. They have sort of body system, namely those two on committee, ask extra experts from outside of committee to write different things for the evaluation for the report. And so, of course, friends are asking friends with the same opinion. There are disclosures in ICNIRP and Senior, but they are not really very standardized or not really checked for details, especially in ICNIRP. Is there accountability? In case of Senior, there is, because the person can be kicked out from the committee, whereas in others, I don't know whether there is any accountability at all in ICNIRP or Bioinitiative. And I don't know whether there are any disclosures of conflict of interest in Bioinitiative, at least I haven't seen it so far. And of course, funding is in case of ICNIRP, there is sort of unclear sources. There are legendary stories on the internet about how ICNIRP is funded. I don't have really good idea how they are funded. Senior is, of course, funded by EU, and Bioinitiative is sort of funded by members' own money. So, and also this way how different questions are asked, for example, on this conflict of interest declaration of ICNIRP, can be misunderstood or understood very, very differently. For example, these accuracy checks are missing, and seems like avoidance of straight answers is there. Namely, for example, question, do you have research support from the industry? And the answer is, I have no personal support from the industry. Well, but do you have institutional or do you have otherwise and so on? But no, I have no personal. Okay, they don't pay to your bank account. Then there are some examples of scientific problems, of course, in different bioelectromagnetics committees. Then first of all is scientific evidence, so this is the selectiveness in collecting or admitting evidence. So, for example, all evidence is listed, you see it, but not considered in practice. This ICNIRP does, because they list all evidence, they show you beautiful tables and everything is listed, but then overall conclusion is that there is no anything. Even though in these listed papers there are something is not, and so on, overall conclusion is that there is nothing. Whereas Bioinitiative has this problem that they mainly select evidence that is supportive of this, what they think is happening. So that's their problem. Then there is another problem that single scientist is making judgment, writing opinion paper on certain topic. This is, of course, problem for Bioinitiative, where each chapters of Bioinitiative report were written by single scientists, and it is not really this kind of committee work as is, for example, committee work for better or worse with ICNIRP. And it was very much criticized, but recently Senior is doing exactly the same. Namely, chapter on epidemiology of the report was written by one person, Joachim Schuss from IARC. So this is also, and this is not good, because then this one person's opinion weighs very much on this, how issue is presented and what final conclusions are. This is not work where different varying opinions are clashing and debates, scientific debates going on. And of course, problem is another, that committees do not want to talk to each other. There is such polarization of this, how science is evaluated, that they don't want to talk to each other. And for example, call for the round table to resolve differences was flatly rejected by everybody. ICNIRP, Bioinitiative, industry, everybody said, like Bioinitiative, we don't want to be hassled by them again. ICNIRP said we don't need their opinion because it will not provide any added value. And so, and of course, industry says we just follow committees what they say. We don't engage in this. Well, and of course, here I'm, I think, repeating this potential impact of the disclosed conflict of interest when this person with disclosure is making, however, decisions, and will those decisions be influenced by the conflict of interest or not? And of course, then is another question: are there irreplaceable experts? So, as the society at large and as the scientific community, should we be solely dependent on the ethics and the consciousness of persons having conflict of interest, or should we intervene and exclude persons with significant conflict of interest from the advisory and decision-making role? And I think that this should be happening, and this sort of happened once, when IARC in 2011 organized this working group. Then Anders Albom from Sweden was invited there to be chair of epidemiology group. Then, before the meeting, Mona Nilsson from Sweden revealed that he has conflict of interest because he is on the board of lobbying firm of his brother that is lobbying for telecom industry in Brussels. And then IARC asked Anders Albom to step down from chairing epidemiological committee, but they asked him to stay as expert without the vote. Well, he didn't like it, and he said that he will not come, so he resigned. But what one could say that IARC was the only committee where people with very, very different opinions from this polarized sides of debate were together in the same room debating. And possibly some people learned their lesson that if you let scientists to debate between themselves, scientists with different opinions, this outcome is difficult to predict. So, better to have all people having the same opinion, because then you easily get consensus. So, in dealing with experts as a society, should we exercise full trust or limited trust and make sure that the skeletons do not remain hidden? I think it is obvious what we should be doing. And finally, a few words about ICNIRP again, and the WHO EMF project. I have 3 slides of this. In my opinion, it's already for years, but more and more clearly is coming out that WHO EMF project is working as a front for implementing ICNIRP opinions. Head of the WHO EMF project is an engineer without expertise in evaluation of biomedical research. She has to rely on others to do this evaluation. And for this reason, WHO EMF project relies completely on biomedical expertise provided by ICNIRP, and this expertise is in form of ICNIRP members helping WHO or ICNIRP members finding suitable experts for the WHO. So, WHO EMF project is the same as ICNIRP in practice. ICNIRP members play a lead role in preparation of environmental health criteria on cell phone radiation, and this is extremely important document because it will decide what will happen with wireless technology in the future to come. If they say everything is fine, it means WHO says everything is fine and industry has absolute carte blanche. And ICNIRP is self-appointing NGO, so meaning members of ICNIRP select new members of ICNIRP. There is no accountability at all. Nobody controls activities of ICNIRP, not control of conflict of interest disclosures, and not control of if their decisions are wrong. What if they are wrong? And can this kind of private club where members select new members be fully trusted with environmental health criteria that is certainly lobbied by Telkom? One can ask me, do I have a proof that Telkom is lobbying ICNIRP? No. Isn't it obvious? If 7 billion users and billions of money industry would not be lobbying, they would be stupid. They do it. Another thing is how and to what extent and so on and so forth. But certainly lobbying efforts are going on. And concerning this environmental health criteria, I sent a message and complaint to Director General of WHO, Dr. Margaret Chan, and seems that she doesn't care at all what is happening in WHO EMF project. Because to my complaint, I received answer. Who was asked to answer to my complaint? Emily van der Wende, head of EMF project. So I was complaining that something is not going well in WHO EMF project, and head of this project explained to me everything is fine, I am wrong. Is this some kind of conflict of interest? Well, there might be so that there is everything in perfect order, but she is not the person who should be answering this kind of question. So, few conclusions. First of all, that IR classification of cell phone radiation as possible carcinogen is sufficient reason for invoking precautionary principle. So we could implement it based on this classification. Claims that the current safety standards protect all users are not supported by scientific evidence. Using for 10 years for half an hour per day, safe phone which you bought from shop can increase your risk of brain cancer according to 3 epidemiological studies. It means safety standards are not protecting you from this kind of increased risk. Users should be informed about this uncertainty and advised to limit exposures whenever possible and feasible, and strongly discouraged from keeping cell phones close to the body. Already in small print of your cell phone brochures, there is written that you should keep cell phone about 1 inch away from your body, because if you keep it closer, then safety standards are not fulfilled, meaning your body is irradiated above safety standards. But there are a couple of questions. Well, first of all, you can always ask and wonder, no, but how I can make phone call? When I make phone call, I always put it to my head, to my ear. So how is this 1 inch? How do I do it? Well, our body was divided by those different committees for those more important and less important parts. Those less important parts are called extremities. They are not vital for functioning of for our living. And one of those parts that is not vital for our living, what is extremity, is our earlobe. Meaning, when you put your cell phone to your head, this earlobe provides this 1 inch spacer distance from your brain. So you can put your cell phone to your earlobe because it is extremity and it is exception that it can be exposed more, but this ear works as spacer that you don't put it closer to your brain. But there is also another story what is not really spoken about. Always you can hear this, that most of radiation exposure you get when you are talking on your cell phone, when you put it to your head or whatever, that then when you are talking, your phone emits most of radiation. This is not anymore truth. That was truth for our stupid phones before smart era, smart cell phones. Namely, then when our cell phones were only for calling or texting, they were indeed emitting most of radiation only then when you were talking on them. And if you kept it away from the body and you used earpiece, you were very little exposed to cell phone radiation. But the situation has changed dramatically, completely, with era of smartphones, but nobody is talking about it. Namely, those cell phones also expose us most when we speak on cell phone. But the same exposure, or even higher, we can get when having this cell phone in pocket, because this cell phone is connected to internet. And once it is connected to internet, it begins to synchronize all your apps on your cell phone. Your Facebook, your Twitter, whatever you have there, weather forecast, news, and so on. It is synchronizing. And when it does it, it emits radiation. It may emit radiation even more than when you are talking on the phone. And at that time, you have this cell phone somewhere in your pocket. For example, for men, now where do I keep this cell phone if I don't have a jacket and a little bit further from me? Keep it in pocket. And another thing, what people are not aware, that when you have internet on your cell phone, you can make a cheap phone calls. You can use Skype. Well, when your safety limit on your cell phone is 2 watts per kilogram, when you use Skype wireless connection, it can go 4 or 5 SAR. It goes sky high as compared with safety standards. When you are using your cell phone for making phone call using Skype connection, you are exposing yourself much more to much higher exposures of radiation than safety standards permit. Nobody talks about it. So, one important thing, don't keep your phone in pocket. And there is also simple advice. All right, now, so what do I do with this cell phone? I have my cell phone right now in my back pocket. This is the only pocket that I have except for jacket. But you can think this way, do you need internet connection all the time? No. You are not talking all the time on the phone. So then when you are not talking, it is not emitting radiation because of talking. But internet is all the time emitting radiation because it's synchronizing. But when it is sitting in your pocket, what for it is? When you walk through city, sit here and you don't check your emails or Facebook, why to have this internet connected? You switch it off. You disconnect from data. And then the cell phone is not emitting any radiation. Then you sit in some cafe or on bench in park. Okay, now you want to look at what happened in the world, you switch on data and instantly you get all this information. So meaning, it's only this that if you like to expose yourself less and you have a smartphone, then switch off this internet then when you don't really use it. Because if it is sitting in your pocket, you don't use it, you don't look at it. Then another conclusion is that real radiation exposure data should be used in epidemiological studies. And this is possible by using applications on smartphones. It's possible to collect real exposure data, because this, what is so far being used, is inadequate. In some studies it is simply a joke. In some studies it is very poor quality exposure data. And then people are, and epidemiologists are all the time saying, we see some effects, but we don't see any dose dependence. And this is used as argument, well, there is absolutely nothing, because if there would be some effect, that it should be correlated with dose. But when you have exposed groups, which are consisting of people who are very much talking on the phone and very little, meaning you are averaging, you never find any dose dependency, because you are averaging everything. Then, of course, this ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable, should be implemented for cell phone radiation exposures, meaning newer technologies should be developed to expose people less and less. And if you force engineers, they will find a way, just necessary to force them. But the only power to force them really, or let's say there are two powers to force them. One is profit, another are governments. Regulations. And finally, this activity of WHO EMF project and memberships of ICNIRP and CENIR should be overhauled, and clear accountability rules should be set. So we should not rely on this kind of private clubs or buddy systems in selecting memberships of these organizations, because they have so much power, and by using this kind of friends and friends of friends, these decisions and evaluations, advice provided by those committees might be biased. Okay, that was all what I had to say. Thank you.
Wir kommen jetzt zu den Fragen und Antworten.